The hot lights of the restaurant flickered as Ava placed the tray down, her hands trembling slightly from the weight of the dinner plates. She felt the eyes on her before she saw them, the judgment, the unspoken sneers from the corner booth. The rich women at the table didn't even glance up. Ava had gotten used to this, the way they looked past her, treating her like a ghost in their world, as though she didn't matter. But today, something was different. It wasn't just the usual dismissive silence, the whispers behind well-manicured hands. No. This time, it was worse. This time, they were looking at her with open contempt. One of them, a tall woman with platinum blonde hair, was the first to speak. She raised her glass of champagne, making eye contact with Ava as she did. The woman's smile was wide, too wide. It was the kind of smile that made your skin crawl. "What's a girl like you doing in a place like this?" The woman's voice dripped with sarcasm, loud enough for everyone in the restaurant to hear. It wasn't just a question. It was an insult. Ava froze, her heart thumping in her chest. She felt a sudden heat rise in her cheeks as the eyes of the other customers shifted toward her. She glanced at the table where the woman's friend sat, 3 others, all wearing designer clothes, their faces painted with the kind of indifference only money could buy. Ava's hands clenched into fists at her sides. They didn't even try to hide the sneers anymore. It was as if they saw her as less than human. Ava was used to this kind of thing. She'd been a waitress for almost a year, and in that time, she had learned to endure the occasional rude comment or look. The whispers about her accent. The mocking glances at her shoes, worn from constant use. She knew what it was like to be dismissed, to be looked down upon because of where she came from, what she looked like, or the fact that she didn't have a $100 bill to tip her way through life. But something about this moment hit her differently. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the way they were delivered, so cruelly, so casually, as if she wasn't even worth a second thought. Ava's stomach twisted. The laughter of the other women joined the first woman's, sharp and cold. Their voices echoed in her ears, each note like a hammer to her chest. They thought they were better than her. They thought she didn't belong here. But Ava wasn't about to let them have the last word. She didn't know why she felt the way she did today, why her skin burned with something more than just embarrassment. Maybe it was because she was tired. Tired of letting people walk all over her. Tired of being silent when they pushed her down. Ava took a slow, deep breath. She could feel the weight of the tray pressing against her palms. Her fingers tingled, and for the first time in months, she felt the urge to do something, something that would break this pattern of silence. She wasn't going to walk away with her head down, not this time. She wasn't going to be the invisible woman they expected her to be. She turned back toward the women, the weight of their gazes still heavy on her. "I'm here to do my job," Ava said, her voice steady but loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "And I do it better than you'd ever know." The laughter stopped. The woman with the platinum blonde hair blinked, as if she hadn't expected that response. The others looked at each other, a brief moment of confusion crossing their faces. Ava didn't wait for them to respond. She turned on her heel and started to walk away, but she could feel the eyes following her every move. She knew they were talking, whispering about her. But something had changed inside her. For the first time, she didn't care. The next few hours passed in a blur. Ava moved through the motions of her shift, taking orders, delivering food, smiling when she needed to, keeping her head down when she didn't. But that encounter, those words, stayed with her. She kept replaying them in her mind, over and over, like a loop she couldn't escape. "What's a girl like you doing in a place like this?" She had never really thought about it before, not in those terms. She was just a waitress. She worked in a fancy restaurant because it was the best job she could get. She was lucky to have a job at all. But the words had unsettled her, made her question herself in a way she hadn't done in years. What was she doing here? What was she doing in this world that never seemed to see her for who she really was? She had dreams, she had hopes. She had a story that no one cared to hear. And yet, she found herself questioning everything. Was this really all she could be? A girl with no future but to serve others? A nameless face in a sea of indifference? The thought made her chest tighten. She had always dreamed of something more, something bigger. She had always believed that if she worked hard enough, she could make a life for herself that didn't involve being invisible, being overlooked. But that moment had brought it all crashing down. It was as though those women had peeled back the layers of her self-worth, exposing the raw vulnerability beneath. And she hated it. It wasn't until later that evening, after the last table had left and she was finishing up her duties, that she had a chance to sit down. The kitchen was quiet, the hum of the dishwashers the only sound breaking the stillness. Ava sat on a small stool near the back, staring out into the empty dining room. She tried to calm her mind, but the words from the table kept coming back, over and over, like a storm she couldn't escape. She had worked so hard to get here. She had fought for every little bit of progress, every step forward. She had come from a place where people didn't believe she could amount to anything. But now? Now, she was starting to doubt that too. Just as she was about to stand up. The door to the kitchen opened, and her manager, Derek, stepped inside. He looked at her with concern in his eyes. "Ava, you good?" he asked, his voice soft. Ava looked up at him and forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." But even as she said the words, she knew they didn't feel true. She wasn't just tired. She was broken. Derek nodded, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "You sure? You've been quiet since those ladies left." Ava didn't respond right away. She just shook her head, unsure of what to say. Derek was one of the few people who'd always treated her with respect. But there was no way she could explain this, explain why she felt like she'd been punched in the gut by their cruelty. "I'll be fine," Ava said, her voice small but firm. "I just need a little time." Derek didn't press any further. He simply gave her a kind smile and nodded before walking out of the room. Ava stood up, glancing at the clock. It was almost time to leave. But as she grabbed her coat and headed for the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had changed. Those women had done more than humiliate her. They had sparked something in her, a fire that was slowly beginning to burn brighter. Ava didn't know what that something was yet, but she could feel it building inside her, ready to break free. She had spent so long allowing herself to be invisible, to be small. But now, she wasn't sure how much longer she could stay in the shadows. The city lights flickered through the smudged window of Ava's small apartment as she sat at the edge of her bed, her thoughts racing. She had barely slept since the incident at the restaurant. Every time she closed her eyes, the words the woman had said echoed in her mind. "What's a girl like you doing in a place like this?" The words replayed over and over like a cruel, relentless loop that wouldn't let her rest. She hadn't been able to shake the humiliation, but more than that, she felt something rising inside her, something she couldn't name. It was anger, sure, but it was more than that. It was as if everything that had been buried deep within her was finally coming to the surface. She was tired of being the invisible one. Tired of letting people like those women make her feel small. Ava stood up and walked over to her tiny kitchen. It wasn't much, just a cramped space with a small stove and a fridge that had seen better days, but it was hers. It was all she had. She opened the fridge door, grabbed the bottle of water, and took a long drink. The coldness didn't do much to calm the heat inside her chest. But it gave her something to do, something to focus on. Her mind drifted back to the restaurant. The woman's voice. The way her friends had laughed, how they had treated her like she was nothing. Ava had been working at that restaurant for months, busting her ass every day. She'd taken every shift, smiled through every insult, and kept her head down because that was what she was supposed to do. That was what she had been taught to do. But that evening had felt different. Those women hadn't just insulted her, they had attacked her dignity, her very existence. They had made her feel like she didn't belong. But I do belong. The thought hit her like a lightning bolt. She didn't know where it had come from, but the sudden realization felt like something awakening inside her. It was like she had spent so long pretending to be small, to be invisible, that she had forgotten who she really was. No one had the right to make her feel like she didn't belong. No one had the right to make her feel like less. She set the bottle down and picked up her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she scrolled to her contacts. She hesitated for a moment before dialing Derek's number. He had always been kind to her, always treated her like a person, not like the help. He had become something of a mentor to her over the past few months. The phone rang a few times before Derek picked up. "Ava?" His voice was warm, concerned. "Everything all right?" Ava paused, unsure of how to even begin explaining what she was feeling. I don't know, Derek. I just need to talk." He was silent for a moment before responding. "Come over to the restaurant. I'll be there in about 20 minutes. We can talk." Ava's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what she needed, but she knew she needed to say something. To talk about what had happened. She grabbed her jacket and rushed out the door, her feet moving faster than her thoughts. As she walked toward the restaurant, she noticed how the night air felt different, colder, more pressing. She was no longer just walking through her routine. This time, it felt like there was a weight on her shoulders, like her entire life was leading to this moment. When she arrived at the restaurant, the place was nearly empty. Only a few late-night patrons lingered at their tables, talking in hushed tones. Ava found Derek in the back, sitting at one of the tables with a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up when she entered, his face lighting up in a way that made her feel seen. "Hey," Ava said quietly as she took a seat across from him. "You all right?" Derek asked again, his voice gentle. There was no judgment in his tone, just concern. "I don't know," Ava whispered, feeling a knot form in her throat. She wasn't sure how to put everything into words, but she had to try. "I feel angry. And I don't know why. I've been doing this job for so long, and I've always just taken whatever comes my way. But last night, those women, what they said, how they looked at me, it felt like I didn't matter. Like I was nothing." Derek listened quietly, nodding as she spoke. He didn't interrupt, just let her pour out the feelings she had kept bottled up for so long. "I don't know what to do, Derek," she continued, her voice cracking. "I've worked so hard to get here, and it's still not enough. It's like no matter what I do, I'm always going to be the invisible one. And I hate it. I hate feeling like I'm not seen." Derek set his coffee down and leaned forward. "Ava, you are seen. I've seen you work. I've seen you grow. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. But you're right about one thing, you don't have to let them make you feel small. You don't have to take their disrespect. You've got more power than you realize." Ava looked at him, a mix of emotions swirling in her chest. "But how do I stop feeling like this? Like I'm just, not enough?" Derek sighed, looking down at his hands for a moment before meeting her eyes again. "You've got to stop letting other people define your worth. Stop letting them control how you see yourself. You can't let them take your strength away. You've got to start fighting back. Not just with words, but with actions." Ava felt a fire light inside her. It was a spark, just a small flicker, but it was there. "What do you mean? How?" Derek smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "I don't know yet. But I think you've already started. By walking away from those women last night, by not letting them get the best of you, you've already taken the first step. Now, you've got to decide what comes next. And it starts with you. Not them. You. Ava nodded, trying to process everything Derek had said. She had always been so afraid to push back, so afraid to stand up for herself. She had spent so much time waiting for things to change, for someone else to make her feel worthy. But Derek was right. She couldn't keep waiting. She stood up, determination filling her. You're right. I can't keep letting people control how I feel. I need to take control of my life. I need to stop being afraid of what others think. Derek stood as well, placing a hand on her shoulder. That's the spirit. But remember, this isn't a quick fix. It's a journey. But I believe in you, Ava. As Ava left the restaurant, her heart felt lighter. She didn't know what the future held, but she was beginning to feel something shift inside her. Maybe it was the first step towards something bigger. Maybe it was the start of a journey where she finally took control of her own story. She didn't know yet, but she was ready to find out. The following week was a blur for Ava. Each day bled into the next as she navigated her work life with an intensity she hadn't felt in a long time. She kept her head down, focused on doing her job, but something had shifted. She wasn't the same person she had been a week ago. The fire Derek had sparked in her refused to die, no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. She started with small steps, holding her ground when the customers made rude comments or glanced at her like she was invisible. There was still that familiar discomfort, that urge to retreat, to apologize for existing in their space. But she kept pushing it down, reminding herself that she had the right to be there just as much as they did. She wasn't going to let their judgments define her. One afternoon, as she was taking an order from a table of businessmen, a familiar face appeared at the entrance of the restaurant. It was Mrs. Lark, one of the women who had humiliated Ava the previous week. She entered with her usual air of superiority, as if the world bent to her every whim. Ava froze for a split second. The last thing she wanted was to face her again. The way Mrs. Lark had looked at her, the way her friends had laughed, it all came rushing back in a painful wave. But Ava took a deep breath and forced herself to move forward. She couldn't let this woman control her any longer. This was her moment to prove that she was stronger than she had been the week before. She walked up to the table, her hands steady as she set down the menu and smiled politely. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Lark," Ava said, her voice calm, though the tightness in her chest made it hard to speak. "What can I get for you today?" Mrs. Lark looked up at her, a slight smirk curling on her lips. Ava could see the recognition in her eyes, the same dismissive look she had worn the week before. Ava braced herself for the usual condescending remarks, but this time, she was ready. She wasn't going to let the woman get the better of her. "What a surprise to see you here," Mrs. Lark said, her tone dripping with mockery. "You must be so pleased to still have a job." Ava's heart skipped, but she forced a smile. "I'm happy to be here, ma'am." Mrs. Lark raised an eyebrow, her eyes scanning Ava's uniform with a look of disdain. "I suppose someone has to do the hard work while people like me enjoy the finer things in life." Her voice was sharp, her words cutting like a knife. Ava felt the sting, but instead of shrinking away like she used to, she met Mrs. Lark's gaze. "Everyone has their role to play," she said simply, trying to keep the conversation civil. "What would you like to order?" Mrs. Lark seemed taken aback for a moment. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone she viewed as beneath her. For a second, there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a sharp, dismissive look. "I'll have the lobster bisque, and a glass of your finest wine." Ava nodded, maintaining her composure. "Coming right up." As Ava walked away, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't much, but it was a victory. She hadn't let Mrs. Lark walk all over her like she had before. And that small act of standing her ground made her feel stronger than she had in a long time. Over the next few days, Ava continued to find her footing. She started to speak up more in her interactions, not just with customers but with her co-workers as well. She had always kept to herself, afraid of drawing attention or making waves. But now, she wasn't so sure that avoiding conflict was the best way to live her life. One evening, as she was cleaning the front of the restaurant, her boss, Mr. Arnold, approached her. He was a man of few words, mostly focused on making sure the place ran smoothly. But there was something in his expression now, something that made Ava nervous. "Ava," he said, his voice low, "can we talk for a minute?" Ava nodded, setting the rag down and following him to the back. She had a bad feeling. Was he going to fire her? Maybe she had been too bold in standing up to customers, maybe he thought she was getting too attitude. When they reached the back office, Mr. Arnold gestured for her to sit. "I've been noticing something about you lately," he began, his tone serious. "You've been more confident, more assertive. Is everything okay?" Ava froze, unsure how to respond. She had been trying to keep a low profile, but clearly, her shift in behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. "Yeah, everything's fine," she said, trying to sound casual. I've been working on myself, you know." Mr. Arnold studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I don't know what's going on, but I like it. You've been handling things a lot better lately. You're making decisions with confidence, and it's showing in your work. Keep it up." Ava blinked, surprised. She had expected criticism, but instead, she was being praised. She smiled, feeling a warm rush of relief wash over her. Maybe Derek was right. Maybe she did have the strength to make a change after all. "Thanks," she said quietly. "I appreciate it." As Ava left the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. There was a shift happening inside her, a transformation she couldn't fully explain. She was no longer content to sit on the sidelines of her own life. But what came next? What was she supposed to do with all this newfound strength? That night, after her shift ended, Ava found herself standing at the edge of the city, staring out at the lights that stretched across the horizon. She had always felt small in the grand scheme of things, like just another face in the crowd. But now, for the first time, she felt as if the world was hers to take. But even as she stood there, a new sense of purpose bubbling inside her, something dark tugged at the edges of her mind. There was something she still couldn't shake, the strange feeling that this wasn't just about standing up to rude customers or fighting for respect. No, there was more at play here, something deeper and more dangerous than she realized. And Ava was beginning to understand that her journey was about to take an unexpected turn. She didn't know what would happen next, but she was starting to suspect that she was on the edge of something big. Something that would change everything. Ava had thought the hardest part was over. But now, she realized the battle wasn't just against rude customers or her self-doubt, it was a fight against a much larger force. As the days passed, her resolve grew stronger, but so did the weight of the challenges ahead. She felt as though she was walking a tightrope, always on the edge of something bigger, something unknown. It was a Monday morning when everything shifted. Ava was walking into the restaurant for her morning shift, her uniform pressed and her posture straight, ready to take on another day. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow on the polished floors and shiny countertops. But something was different today. There was an undercurrent in the air, a subtle tension that Ava couldn't quite place. It made her skin prickle, a feeling she couldn't shake no matter how hard she tried. As she approached the staff room, she saw the familiar faces of her co-workers. But today, there was an unfamiliar air about them too. They were speaking in low tones, exchanging glances as if they were hiding something. Ava, always one to keep to herself, felt a jolt of curiosity. What was going on? "Hey, Ava," Karen, one of her fellow waitresses, called out, though there was an awkwardness in her voice. "Can we talk for a minute?" Ava raised an eyebrow. Karen had never been particularly friendly, but she wasn't the type to avoid confrontation. Ava followed her to the corner of the room where Karen lowered her voice. "Ava, I don't know how to say this, but we need to be careful," Karen said, her eyes darting around the room as though she was afraid someone would overhear. "There's something happening at the restaurant." "Something off." Ava's curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Karen hesitated. "Have you noticed anything strange lately? Like, weird orders or people asking about you?" "I don't know, it just feels different here." Ava frowned, her mind racing. She'd noticed the change in the air, but hadn't connected it to anything specific. She hadn't thought much of the strange tension among the customers or the way some of the regulars had started acting oddly around her. But now, Karen's words seemed to pull everything into focus. There was something more happening here than just rude clients and her own self-improvement. "Strange orders? People asking about me?" Ava repeated, a sense of unease creeping in. "Yeah," Karen continued, looking over her shoulder before speaking again. "You remember Mrs. Lark, right? Well, after she came in last week, things haven't been the same. She's been asking about you. I don't know why, but there's been a lot of talk about you in the background." Ava's stomach dropped. Mrs. Lark. That name sent a chill down her spine, the memory of the woman's condescending remarks still fresh in her mind. She couldn't understand why anyone would be interested in her, especially someone like Mrs. Lark. But there was something in Karen's tone that made her realize it wasn't just idle gossip. Something more serious was at play. "Is this about the way she treated me?" Ava asked cautiously. Karen shook her head. "No, it's not just that. There's more. I overheard something the other night. Some of the higher-ups are involved too, and I don't know if it's something to be worried about, but—" Ava cut her off, her heart racing. "Higher-ups? What do you mean?" "I don't know all the details, but there's talk about moving people around, shifting things. It's like they've got their eyes on you, Ava," Karen said, looking around nervously. "It's not just you. Something's happening, and I think you need to be careful. I wouldn't be surprised if someone's been spreading rumors, or worse." Ava took a step back, her mind reeling. She had always assumed the worst came from customers, the rude remarks, the judgmental stares. But now it seemed like there were forces within the restaurant, hidden behind closed doors, that were beginning to target her. This wasn't about a single woman's snobbery. This was about something larger, something far more sinister than she could have imagined. "I'll keep an eye out," Ava replied, though she wasn't sure if she could believe Karen's vague warnings. She wasn't used to conspiracies or office politics. She had enough on her plate just trying to survive every day at work. But there was something about Karen's words that felt real. Ava couldn't ignore the growing unease. As she walked through the restaurant to start her shift, she noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The tension Karen had described was tangible now, hanging in the air like a thick fog. Ava couldn't help but wonder if she was being paranoid, but everything felt different. The customers looked at her with an intensity that unsettled her, their eyes narrowing as if they were silently judging her. She had always been able to handle the occasional rude comment or stare, but today felt different. Around midday, things took a strange turn. Ava was in the kitchen when she overheard a conversation between two managers, Steve and Carla. She tried to pretend she hadn't heard, but their words froze her in place. "You know, I don't think she realizes what she's gotten herself into," Steve said, his voice low. "She doesn't know that the eyes on her aren't just from customers." Carla's voice came next, soft but sharp. "What do you mean?" "She's become a target." "I think she's being tested," Steve replied. You can't just be someone like her and think they'll leave you alone. Not in this industry. Ava felt the blood drain from her face as she stood frozen in the doorway, her heart pounding. She hadn't been imagining things. She wasn't just another waitress anymore. She was under scrutiny, being watched, tested, and for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. What did they want from her? What game were they playing? Ava quickly backed out of the room, trying to make her movements seem natural as she left the kitchen. She needed to process this, needed to make sense of what she had just overheard. But the more she thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit together. There was something more here than simple office gossip, something deeper and darker than she had realized. That evening, as she walked home after her shift, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. She glanced over her shoulder more than once, but there was no one there. She was starting to feel like a character in one of those suspense thrillers, where every shadow could be hiding a threat, where every step felt like it brought her closer to something she couldn't control. She turned down an alley that led to a shortcut, hoping to shake off the uneasy feeling. But as she walked deeper into the shadows, she heard footsteps behind her. They were getting closer, quickening. Ava's breath caught in her throat as she spun around, her heart racing. No one. The alley was empty. But just as she was about to turn back, a voice called from the darkness. You've been asking too many questions. Ava froze, her stomach dropping. She didn't recognize the voice, but there was something chilling in its tone. What do you want? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. A figure stepped forward from the shadows. It was a man, his features obscured by the dim light. But the one thing Ava could make out clearly was the cold, calculating gleam in his eyes. You need to stop digging, Ava, the man said, his voice low and threatening. There are things you don't understand. Things you don't want to. Ava took a step back, her pulse pounding in her ears. Who are you? She demanded, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The man smiled, a cold, twisted smile that made her blood run cold. You'll find out soon enough. And just like that, he disappeared into the night, leaving Ava alone with more questions than answers. What had she gotten herself into? Who were these people? And why were they watching her? One thing was clear now, this wasn't just a story about a waitress being humiliated. Ava was caught up in something much bigger, something dangerous. And she didn't know if she was strong enough to survive it. The days felt like they were blurring together. Ava couldn't remember when she had started waking up every morning with a pit in her stomach, the unsettling feeling of being watched never far from her mind. Every corner she turned, every step she took, seemed to echo with the weight of the strange events unfolding around her. She hadn't told anyone what had happened in the alley. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Her co-workers were acting distant, and the few friends she had made in the restaurant had been strangely quiet, avoiding eye contact as if they knew something she didn't. The whispers continued. At first, Ava had thought she was imagining it, people talking behind her back, glancing at her in a way that made her skin crawl. But now, she couldn't ignore it. She couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. The customers who came in, once friendly faces, now gave her calculating looks. Mrs. Lark, in particular, seemed to show up more frequently, always with her eyes trained on Ava, as if studying her like a lab rat. Ava hadn't spoken to anyone about the man in the alley, but his warning had stayed with her, gnawing at her like a constant reminder that she was out of her depth. Stop digging, he had said. You'll find out soon enough. The words echoed in her mind, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on her, tightening around her like a noose. Her shift the next day was uneventful, but the tension in the restaurant was palpable. It was the kind of day where every movement felt deliberate, every action seemed weighted with intent. As Ava passed between tables, she felt the familiar eyes on her, but today it wasn't just customers. It was her co-workers, too. There was a new energy in the air, something she couldn't quite place, but it felt wrong. Ava had just cleared a table when she noticed Mrs. Lark sitting in the corner, as usual. But this time, she wasn't alone. There was a man with her, someone Ava hadn't seen before. He was tall, his face hidden behind dark sunglasses, even though the restaurant was dimly lit. His suit was tailored perfectly, but it wasn't the suit that caught Ava's attention, it was the way he looked at her. His gaze lingered for too long, and when their eyes met, Ava felt a chill run down her spine. She quickly averted her gaze, her pulse quickening. Why was he staring at her like that? What did he want? The man wasn't just a stranger, he was someone who had purposefully locked eyes with her, and it wasn't out of curiosity. Are you okay? Karen's voice snapped Ava out of her thoughts. She hadn't even realized she was staring at the man until Karen asked. You've been standing there for a minute. Ava shook her head, trying to shake off the unease. I'm fine. Just distracted. Karen nodded, but there was something in her expression that made Ava think she knew more than she was letting on. She had seen the way Karen looked at the man when she brought their drinks to the table. It wasn't the casual glance of a waitress, it was a knowing look, a look that suggested Karen recognized him. Ava's mind raced, but before she could ask, the man stood up and walked toward the exit. His eyes never left her face, even as he crossed the room. There was something deliberate in his movement, like he was leaving a message in his wake. And as quickly as he had arrived, he was gone. For the rest of the shift, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She kept her head down, trying to focus on the tasks in front of her, but the sense of danger hung in the air like a storm cloud. She couldn't help but wonder if the strange man and Mrs. Lark were connected in some way. Were they part of the same group? Was she being targeted by the restaurant's higher-ups? Was she just another pawn in a game she didn't understand? By the time she got home, the weight of the day had settled on her shoulders. She was exhausted, mentally and physically, but there was no rest. Not now. Not when she could feel something closing in on her. She paced around her small apartment, unable to shake the restless energy that buzzed through her. She hadn't slept well in days, and the fear of what might be coming next gnawed at her every thought. Ava had always been resourceful. She'd survived the worst of it all, dealt with her share of heartbreak and hardship. But this? This was different. This wasn't just about surviving, it was about finding the truth, even if it meant risking everything. The next morning, Ava woke up to a message on her phone. She didn't recognize the number. Meet me at 2 p.m. at the park. I have information about the people who are watching you. Don't tell anyone. You'll regret it if you do. Ava's breath caught in her throat. Who was this? How did they know what was happening? Was this some kind of trick? A trap? But then again, what did she have to lose? Ava had been running in circles, trying to figure out who was behind the strange events in her life. The man in the alley had warned her to stop digging, but she couldn't. She couldn't let fear control her. Not when she was so close to the truth. She debated for a long time, standing by the window and looking out at the street below. She had been cautious her whole life, always second-guessing her instincts. But now? She was done playing it safe. She was going to find out what was going on, no matter the cost. At 2 p.m., she walked to the park, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was cool, the sky overcast, and the ground was still wet from a rainstorm earlier in the morning. Ava felt like she was walking into an unknown territory, every step bringing her closer to something she couldn't turn back from. The park was empty, save for a few scattered people jogging or walking their dogs. Ava kept her eyes peeled, looking for any sign of the person who had sent the message. She glanced at her phone, checking the time. It was almost 2:10. She was about to give up when she saw him. The man from the restaurant. He was standing near the bench, his back turned to her. Ava felt her pulse spike. She hadn't expected him to show up here, but there he was. His suit was impeccably tailored, and the sunglasses, those same dark sunglasses, were perched on his face once more. He hadn't even acknowledged her presence, but Ava knew it was him. She walked over slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. As she reached the bench, he finally turned to face her. The air between them crackled with tension. "You came," the man said, his voice smooth but cold. "I wasn't sure you would. Most people wouldn't." Ava swallowed hard. "Who are you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear swirling inside her. He smiled, though it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a smile of someone who knew exactly what was happening, and who had the power to control it. "I'm someone who knows things," he said. "Things about the people you're dealing with. The people who are watching you. And I'm here to help you, Ava." Ava didn't know whether to trust him or run. Her gut told her that the man was connected to everything, the strange events, the whispers, the danger that had followed her. But there was something about him, something that made her feel like he held all the answers, even if he wasn't ready to give them to her. "Help me," she repeated, trying to gauge his sincerity. "Why?" "Because you're in way over your head," he said, taking a step closer. "And if you don't take action soon, everything you've worked for will be destroyed." Ava's breath caught in her throat. "What do you want from me?" He paused, looking her up and down. "I want you to join us." The words hung in the air between them, a lingering chill that froze Ava in place. "Join us," she repeated, her mind racing. She had heard enough warnings, enough cryptic messages, to know that whatever this man was offering, it came with strings attached, strings she wasn't sure she wanted to touch. The park around them felt suffocating, the air thick with an unseen weight. People walked by, unaware of the tension in the air, but Ava couldn't shake the feeling that everything around her had shifted. The calm she had once felt in the park, the comfort of being in nature, was gone. Instead, she felt as though she were standing in the eye of a storm, and it was only a matter of time before everything around her spiraled out of control. The man studied her silently, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, but there was something about his posture, something about the way he waited, that made Ava feel as though he was in complete control of the situation. The power dynamic was clear, he was the one who held the cards, and she was the one desperately searching for a way out of this tangled mess. "Why should I trust you?" Ava's voice was steady, though she was fighting the urge to back away. She didn't know if it was fear or intuition, but something in her gut was screaming that this man was no ally. "What do you want from me?" He chuckled softly, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Trust is a luxury, Ava," he said. "You don't have the luxury of trust right now. You have to think about survival. About protecting yourself." He stepped closer, his presence suddenly more imposing. "You're in this deep already. You're a part of something bigger than you realize. If you don't align yourself with the right people, you won't make it out unscathed." Ava took a step back, feeling the weight of his words. The right people? Who was he talking about? The people who had been watching her? Mrs. Lark? The strange man in the alley? And who were these others he kept mentioning? "I'm not getting involved in whatever you're talking about," Ava said firmly, shaking her head. "I want out. I want this to be over." The man's expression shifted, no longer playful. It was cold now, calculating. "You can't just walk away, Ava," he said. "This isn't something you can walk away from. You're already too far in. You've seen too much." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "You know what's coming. Don't pretend you don't." Ava swallowed hard. The knot in her stomach tightened as memories flooded her mind, Mrs. Lark's unnerving visits, the strange man in the alley, the feeling of being hunted, the whispers among her co-workers. She had been ignoring the signs, hoping it would all go away, but now they were impossible to deny. She had been caught in a web of something much larger than she had ever imagined. The man took another step closer. "They're already watching you, Ava. And if you don't act fast, it won't just be your job on the line. It'll be your life." Ava felt her heart race. The words hit her like a slap, but there was something in them, something that rang with truth. She could feel it now, deep in her bones. She wasn't just in danger of losing her job. She was in danger of losing everything. The game was bigger than her, and if she didn't take control, she might not make it out alive. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but I'm done being manipulated," Ava said, her voice shaking but strong. She took another step back. "I'm done with this." The man's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "You're brave," he said. "But bravery won't save you in this world. I told you, you don't have a choice. Not anymore." Ava's pulse quickened, her thoughts spinning. She had to make a choice. She couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding from the truth. It was time to face whatever was coming for her. The stakes were too high. Suddenly, Ava remembered something the man had said during their conversation in the alley. He had warned her not to dig too deep. He had known about the whispers, about the danger lurking in the shadows. He knew something she didn't. She looked up at him, her eyes narrowing. "You know what's going on, don't you?" she asked. "You know who's behind this. You know what they want from me." The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he took off his sunglasses, revealing cold, piercing eyes that seemed to see right through her. "I know enough," he said. "But if you really want to know, you'll have to play the game. You'll have to make your choice. Are you in or out?" Ava's thoughts raced. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her chest, suffocating her. If she accepted his offer, she would be stepping into a world she knew nothing about. A world full of shadows, manipulation, and lies. But if she refused, if she walked away, what would happen then? Would they let her go? Or would they come after her, as they had threatened? "You're making this harder than it has to be," the man said, his voice growing colder. "You can't escape what's already in motion. But you can be a part of it, or you can be crushed by it." Ava stood still, her body trembling as the decision weighed heavily on her. She had always believed that she could control her own destiny, that she could shape her life, but now she realized that there were forces at play beyond her comprehension. There were people out there who could destroy her if they chose to. And she didn't know how much longer she could fight them. "I don't want to be a pawn in someone's game," Ava said, her voice barely a whisper. She felt as though she was being torn between two worlds, one where she could stay silent and disappear, and another where she fought for the truth, even if it meant losing everything. The man stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "Then you'll lose, Ava. You'll lose everything." And in that moment, something clicked inside Ava. She realized that she couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding. She had to fight, not for the people who had wronged her, but for herself. She had to find a way to expose the truth, to take back control of her life. Ava took a deep breath, standing tall. "I'm done being scared," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "I don't care what's coming. I'm not going to let you, or anyone, control me anymore." The man's eyes darkened, and he took a step back, clearly caught off guard by her newfound strength. For a moment, the world around them seemed to hold its breath. "You're making a mistake," he warned, his voice cold and dangerous. "You won't survive on your own. But if that's what you want, so be it." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Ava standing alone in the park, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in weeks, Ava felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know what dangers still lurked in the shadows. But she was done being controlled. Done being a victim. She was going to take her life back. This marks the conclusion of Ava's intense journey, with her choosing to take control of her fate, no matter the consequences. The lesson here is about resilience and empowerment, standing up for oneself in the face of overwhelming odds, and refusing to be controlled by fear or manipulation.